There's been a massive expansion of safe supply in BC as Bonnie Henry and the NDP government have set to double down and expand every safe supply program put out before them. Now, to cover it with me, I brought in Brittani, who is from BC, a taxpayer from BC, from the Telltale First Nations, as we are set to break down the most ridiculous thing I saw so far, which is Unlearning and Undoing White Supremacy and Anti-Indigenous Racism in BC's Office of the Provincial Health Officer. Brett, how has white supremacy and safe supply affected you personally?
Yeah, no, this is quite the interesting take. I'm trying to figure out myself how exactly it's white supremacists who are making the drug problem worse. At this point, right now, it's the drug dealers and the gangsters.
And I do
So,
enjoy the thought that we are the first word is unlearning, which is very interesting to me. If anything, yes, the kids are doing too much learning today. This is the number one problem facing society. But it's always interesting that we have to unlearn something when it comes to drugs, and it's very interesting that it's scientific because the whole framework of this is unlearning, which means that shouldn't we be basing science on like previously established norms, not learning to look at data and then not listen to it? This seems to be counterintuitive.
it's very backwards because the data coming out of British Columbia since this safe supply program was implemented and the decriminalization, the last few years, the numbers have gotten worse. It's not gotten better. People are dying just as much, if not more, than they were. We're losing 8 people a day in British Columbia. The number one killer of children right now is drugs. So it's interesting that they're overlooking all of the data and information that was presented in the last few months when they decided to actually back off of the decriminalization program due to the harm that was observed. So it's interesting that we're going to go ahead and just push forward and do it all over again.
So, according to the report, the Office of the Provincial Health Officer is committed to upholding anti racist approaches, Indigenous rights, truth and reconciliation with Indigenous peoples. The OPHO is committed to identifying anti Indigenous racism and white supremacy in its day to day work and deliberately taking anti racist and anti white supremacy approaches. Progress in this uncomfortable and challenging work is often slower than desired, and mistakes will continue to be made along the way. But this work is continuing in good faith. As someone in BC who fits whatever minority characteristics they just throw out in that field, do you feel comforted by this statement at all?
No, this is not in good faith. The data speaks against it. And it's really quite simple. You just go down to Vancouver and you can see that the downtown east side is no better than it was 5 years ago. If anything, it's worse. For every one person that passes away, there's two more that show up because they know that there's free drugs. So I no, there's been no difference. I've seen no difference when it comes to harm reduction, and especially in my community in Langley.
Here's what they would say. Okay. Going on in the anti-racist approaches within the Alternatives to Unregulated Drugs report. Settler colonial governments and institutions have created the social and structural conditions within which substance use is regulated. Harms disproportionately occur in indigenous populations. Harm reduction must include reducing the harms of settler colonialism, such as reducing substance harms through decolonization and shared responsibility across all government portfolios. The OPHO acknowledges responsibility to eradicate racism and settler colonialism within its reporting structure and process. The office is working to review its report within process to identify how racism, white supremacy manifests in the global undoing of racist policies and practices. More blah, 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 blah. From what I can translate this, and listen, I am a fluent English speaker. I have a degree from a university that is considered a good one in the world. I'm not 100% sure what this means. I know what all the words mean individually. I don't always understand the context in which they're arranged. But what can I deduce from this is there are settler colonial institutions and governments. And I would like your opinion sort of on what is settler colonialism. And this seems to be anything related to Canada. It's just generally there is some form of original sin within all of Canadian institutions. This then carries with it all, whether white supremacy, anti-Indigenourism, all the isms with it, and it's these systems that create the problem. So by destroying the fabric of society and these systems and institutions, and we loosen the bonds because their bonds are constricting mostly, they seem to say, indigenous people, but also other non-whites in this world. The bonds have been constricted on them. This is then leading them to do drugs. And then if the bond society would be off, then they would simply, I guess, stop doing drugs, or no one would have a problem with them doing drugs. But the problem seems to be on society himself. So, how do you feel as, I guess, an indigenous person, or you could even say woman too, or all the isms you carry, being used to justify basically the destruction of our institutions?
I just find it very interesting that, that they go about it in a way of blaming it on colonization, essentially. And then they're saying, well, by decolonizing and removing white supremacy, that somehow that will fix the problems with drug issues on the reserves. I'm having a hard time understanding, because my impression, at least, I thought that colonialism and settlers and all this was like, the people that came here hundreds of years ago. I didn't know that was like everybody. So I'm confused why it would be that they're having, in this context, the way that they're speaking about colonizers and such and white supremacists. It almost sounds like they want to remove those people from the communities and that will solve the drug issue. But at the same time, those same people are going to be bringing in the drugs. So I really don't understand exactly what they're saying here when they're trying to basically say that harm reduction will be done by decolonization or the practice of decolonization.
You're very astute to point out that the practice of colonization was to give a lot of white people giving lots of indigenous people drugs, getting them hooked and addicted to drugs that they hadn't done before, and creating societal problems. And decolonization seems to be introducing even more potent drugs from white people to indigenous people decolonize.
Yes. Because it's not the leaders of the First Nations that are asking for this. This is Bonnie Henry who's suggesting this, even though the data is showing that this has been a harmful approach for the province, especially for our youth and our reserves. There's a lot of youth deaths, actually. This is even before the drug problem, the opioid crisis. It just is a thing that has happened and it's a problem. So to be putting the children, in my opinion, the youth under 25 at risk like this is desensitizing the seriousness of opioid addiction. Destigmatizing drugs was the stupidest thing we ever did here in British Columbia. I'll reiterate that every chance I have.
I mean, it's when you read the combined approaches, and yeah, if you read more of it, the more than we have. The thing is, they do fundamentally believe that addiction is driven by stigma in a lot of ways, and this has become a solution, is to destigmify. I'll add this: like, I remember back in the day at the beginning of harm reduction. What harm reduction actually was is there was two schools in addiction medicine. One was like hard abstinence, right? Just get off drugs, hard abstinence. No, 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 no. And then there became sort of a new method. And the original harms reduction, but this is before safe supply, was okay. People can't fully all the time get off drugs. We want them to do less drugs or wean them off of drugs. So methadone, right? And then Suboxone, right? So the thought is, if you're doing opioids, to do less potent ones that you can function off of, that we can then wean you off of and get lower doses, and then try and quit drugs, or absolutely minimize the amount of drugs people do because drugs are bad. That was the original harm reduction, is understanding that not everyone can take a maximalist cold turkey approach and cater a way to get other people off of drugs, or mitigate the harm of it. This version of harm reduction, what it is morphed into and what has been co-opted into, is safe supply. And safe supply is just giving people drugs willy-nilly. And the organizations that did the studies to look at it, I mean, the original studies for safe supply are basically self-report quality of life things from drug addicts, which means they ask people addicted to opium, do you like free opium? Do you want free opium? And they said yes. And they said, you get free opium, will you be happier? And they said yes. And then this works because it's proven that if you give opium addicts opium, they enjoy opium. This is what we proved in the 21st century. And then this is now morphed into safe supply. So the science of this is flimsy, and I think the science of people doing it are, this is the dangers of social science. All right. All right, let's get back onto The recommendations. What do David Eby and Bonnie Henry recommend we do about people on drugs? Number one, the province of British Columbia should explore implementing, with appropriate safeguards, and evaluating scalable programs that enable access to non-prescribed alternatives to unrelated drugs. Unregulated. Like, is this sounds like just giving out hard drugs randomly, either selling them legally or decriminalizing everything.
When they say unregulated drugs, they literally mean like crack, meth, heroin, maybe even fentanyl. Like this isn't including Suboxone, Dilaudid, methadone, or any of the drugs that an opioid addict would choose to take if they were trying to detox. These are not those drugs.
It's off the thing. They go on to explain these programs would be in addition and complementary to the ongoing implementation and improvement of prescribed alternatives, policies, and programs. The multi-model approach is required to meet the needs and thereby save the lives of people who use drugs. Much depends on the details of how non-prescribed alternatives would be made available. BC has world-leading expertise that can be called upon if giving enabling leadership encouragement to explore innovative solutions and investment by decision makers. This I love. I love this, other than the fact that people are going to die for the insane stupidity, but this they admit that it's not going to work and they know it's not going to work, but they're going to pay lots of this is Justin Trudeau 101. This is like we're going to set up a lobbying factor and we're just going to pay people to study this and come up with ideas because giving people drugs isn't a life-saving thing, but we're going to try and think of a second thing to do if giving them all the drugs they want doesn't work. Brilliant, not for the taxpayer, but it's sort of classic in a modern Canadian sense. Feeling a bit patriotic. Okay, number two, and organizations that represent those with living experience of substance abuse must be engaged in planning, design, and implementation of all programs and policies that enable access to alternatives and unregulated drug supply. So the lived experience of the drug addicts. Not only do we need the drug addicts to get free drugs, but they need to be running the logistics of the entire operation.
Oh, yes, because this is what they did in Vancouver in the downtown east side. They decided they wanted to try this approach and they consulted with VANDU, Vancouver Area Network of Drug Users. And yeah, of course, they wanted free drugs. And now they're actually in litigation and they're suing them for embezzlement. So Vandu and Dolph, I guess, both stole money from the province and didn't actually fulfill the duties that they'd agreed on in their contract.
Are you telling me that putting a bunch of drug addicts in charge of a drug supply resulted in a net loss due to potential theft of the drugs?
And they got high on their own supply. So yes, it was a very interesting story. I believe Adam Zivo may have even covered a bunch of it. I think it was 2022 that that story came out. But I mean, like it's been proven, like these area network users advocate. They say yes, it's great, it works good. I mean, of course, if you don't have to get high, if you don't have to work, if it's destigmatized, if it's legal, if you can live downtown Vancouver in the most beautiful city, it's very expensive, but you don't have to pay for it. Of course, why wouldn't you do that? It's beautiful weather all year. You don't even need to pay rent. You can just set up a tent right down on the water.
Maybe the third recommendation will make a lot of sense and send the province on the right track. Let's see. The province of British Columbia should pursue meaningful partnership in this work through effective co-governance with Indigenous organizations and governing bodies as required to uphold the inherent rights of Title of First Nations BC and the inherent rights of First Nation, Métis, and Inuit people in BC. Strategies must be developed to ensure that the obligations described in the Unlearning and Undoing section of this report are met in context of alternatives and of unregulated drugs. This would include increasing Indigenous communities' self-direction on matters related to psychoactive substances, addressing issues related to rural and remote communities and urban and away from home Indigenous populations, and determining how enabling access to alternatives can complement Indigenous harm reduction and other efforts. Okay, it's a bit of a mouthful, but it seems like at best case scenario, they're just saying nothing, and they seem like maybe Indigenous people can use ayahuasca to get rid of drug addiction. Just throw more drugs at this. That's probably the best, most interpretive reading of this. I fear, though, that this is them partnering with some corrupt far left Aboriginal groups to bring in drug cartel of safe supply nonsense onto the reserves and into the communities, and do irreparable harm.
I find it all to be quite strange, if I'm being honest, with the mention of you just said it left my mind, but
But yeah, they're partnering with indigenous. This is a partnership with indigenous people, and they want to do that. And they're partnering with indigenous people. They use the phrase unregulated drugs, which means that they added in psychoactive substances that they could use. So that to me reads as like, I went to Coachella and people there did ayahuasca and he was wearing a headdress. So I know this is indigenous healing magic. So we'll be maybe doing that. It seems like basically if you're indigenous and you want to do anything related to drugs in BC, it looks like you can kind of just do it, right? You don't
yeah.
have to be the leader, you don't have to be a chief, you don't have to be I think you just have to be maybe over 18, maybe not. Declare yourself an indigenous drug something, say this is to fight white supremacy, and then you can essentially deal drugs or be part of the government drug cartel. That's how I interpret this.
Well, like the way that they kind of worded it too, it kind of almost made it sound like it's our right, like it was already something that had been negotiated into our rights before, like something they almost made it sound like regarding the Indian Act and all of the negotiations and rights that we were given that or something like that, like almost that's what kind of alarmed me was that they almost made it sound like this is something that's just always been acceptable when most reserves for like 100 years have been trying to get dry and like people have been fighting and pushing back and it's affected generations. We've got grandparents that are raising their grandkids because their children overdose and stuff like that. So like no, highly doubt that you will find Indigenous leaders across the province saying, yes, bring the drugs, let's go. Like, there's so many more steps that the province could be taking first. More RCMP. We don't have enough port police. We got borders wide open. We got people coming in that are literally just like, we got the Sinaloa cartel in British Columbia, human trafficking people into Washington. We've got gangs, like actual real gangs, big gangs. They do crime and then they get out the next day and shit. Like, there's so much more that we could be doing. We've got people that are committing serious crimes against women and children, drug dealers, all of it, gangsters, up on the reserves, and then they're released back onto the reserve to traditional territory because that's their right. And no thought of the rights of the victims, but a right to put these people right back into the community. Very, very small community, I may add, not a city or nothing. Small village. And so, these people are committing crimes and then going back into the community, reoffending, and that's not being dealt with. The gangs and all that is just, it's running rampant. We just seen a story actually in the CBC just a couple of weeks ago about safe supply being diverted to gangsters on reserves in, I think it was Manitoba or Saskatchewan. And they had kids, actual kids selling drugs on their reserve. So we've already got evidence of this, and the CBC themselves reported on it. I think there was even like a in-depth video done. So if you want to find it, it's just a few days ago. So yeah, I don't see how this is. There's not going to be any benefit. I can guarantee that.
Yeah, I think it's a pretty solid guarantee. We have enough history and like you want to say historical evidence, biological evidence. Like if you want to just Google something, you can Google the opium wars about fighting over opium and access to it. Like okay, substances that are addictive have value. And if you set the market at zero, which means you're just giving opium for free and flooding the market, people are going to take that and resell it elsewhere because opium itself does have some currency value, right? There is some value to opium to and the maybe not to you out there listening who doesn't have an opium addiction and you don't want it, but to someone who's dependent on it or it is much higher than it. So when you flood the market with free opium, you're creating a glut, and and you create a problem where now it's more accessible to kids because you can have gangsters who take free opium and then resell it for $5, and then you can undercut the market of other drugs because you have opium coming in for free, where usually opium would be more expensive because you have to manufacture, produce it, and get it yourself. But we have the Canadian government cutting out the entire supply, glutting the market with opium, which is going to lead to people selling cheap opium, which is going to lead to people doing opium, which is going to lead to people being addicted to opium. This is how the world works.
And like the opium before, like all the heroin and stuff in the 90s was coming from China, and then the fentanyl was coming also from China here recently. So it wasn't the white supremacists who were getting the safe supply into the downtown east side. At first it was unregulated supply from the Sinaloa cartel and the Chinese and some of the Punjabi gangs, but it was coming into Canada. Now in British Columbia, we are exporters. We make it and send it out. Like in the last few years, we're sending out more drugs than we're bringing in. So it's hard for me to really understand how any of this is harm reduction or safe in any way when we're actually doing more harm, and the numbers show it, and the crime is up here, and it's definitely not white supremacy. I'll say that much. I don't see how it has anything to do with white people at all, in fact.
Speaking of white people, this document was brought to you by mostly white people, and I think it's important to bring up the acknowledgments here, and you can put it on screen. It's most people define themselves as white settlers of some point, and even people who are not white are a first generation or second generation settler. So there's no way of scooping it. But some people even earn the title of occupier. One Kate Youngblood is an occupier. Well, Abigail Steinberg is a white occupier of mixed European and Ashkenazi Jewish descent. I don't understand why they bring up racial divisions within Jews, which are also sort of a construct of white racists in the 19th century as well. So I don't really understand that's decolonizing. But in perspective, like, is this at any way common discourse within Indigenous communities that everyone is a settler, and then occupiers? Is there a difference there, or are most people Canadians of some sort?
Most of my family, like those words, I never hear them, but I see it a lot online. So I can't speak for everyone, of course, because I do live in the city. But yeah, no, my family, they don't look at it like that. Like nobody uses those words. Everybody's different though. I can't speak for everyone.
Yeah, it is.
Yeah, but like these people in the list though that were making the reference, I looked and like all of them reference their race, but conveniently none of them are even indigenous. There's one person and she says that she's Métis, but she lives in Vancouver, which means that she doesn't even live on reserve. So I just thought it was quite interesting that it was all people who made a point of virtue signaling and showing their race to chime in on how they supported this idea with Bonnie Henry, but none of them live on reserve, and there's no like listing of indigenous leaders or even organizations that could have put their 2 cents in. So I just found that to be quite interesting, and that they
It's
had the
no
virtue.
for a report that talks so much about fighting anti-Indigenous racism and makes a point of needing to connect with more Indigenous voices and valuing Indigenous voices above all else due to intersectional magic. There are no there are no voices of Indigenous that meet this golden criteria, even though there are thousands of them available to talk to, but they didn't get it. That is very interesting. It reminds me a lot of, and I'm used to it, of the went on a tangent from my university days. I once took a course in musical history. This was always stuck with me. It was a fun bird course that I took with my friends. It was an easy musical history course, and every unit, the prof would always talk about at some point how white people stole black music and black people with basically we talk about how black people's contributions to every industry had been undermined. And I remember each chapter in the textbook was about 40 pages. Then we get to the section about rap, 20 pages. Who do we cover? The Beastie Boys and Vanilla Ice. And he was so excited. He was just going on about the Beastie Boys and the thing. So he spent the entire time talking about black people. And then we got to rap, the literal smallest section in the book, where we spent the most time talking about the whitest rappers, and to me that was the beauty of progress. Is that so, Brittany? Thank you so much for joining us. How can people find you, and where can people go to get the most amount of free drugs near your house?
Well, you can find me on Twitter at brat_world. Um, Honestly, you don't have to look far. It's everywhere. It's not even hard. You can literally Google on your phone where to find drugs, and Google will like tell you where you can go. It's crazy. So, but don't do it, kids. Drugs are bad.
All right. There's your take. Brittany disagrees with all the medical experts and says drugs are bad. Renegade, crazy thinking. Thanks so much.
Thank you.